Hello, listeners. Welcome to our channel. Today, we are going to talk about the topic how the Europe's carbon tax is hurting the Indian exports. Now, first of all, we need to see over here that what is exactly the problem going on in the Europe and how it is impacting the exports which our country is making. Now, first of all, the climate change is one of the biggest problems which we are facing today. And cutting down on carbon emissions is crucial to stop it from getting worse. Industrial activity is responsible for over 25% of global carbon emissions, and countries are trying different ways to tackle the problem. The European Union, the EU, is taking one of the most ambitious steps with its new carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is CBAM tax, which will be fully in place by 2026. We know the word tax can make us the tune out, but stay with us. This one could have big effects, especially for India. Let's break it down what CBAM is and what it matters for. CBAM is basically a tax on carbon heavy goods that are imported into the EU, like steel, aluminium, cement, fertilizers, and electricity. The goal is to prevent something called carbon leakage. This happens when companies move their factories to countries with weaker environmental laws just to avoid paying carbon taxes. The EU wants to level the playing field by charging this tax on imported goods so that foreign companies have to pay the same price for their carbon emissions as EU based companies do through the emission trading system. Now, here's how it works. EU companies already have to pay for their carbon emissions through the ETS, a system where businesses buy carbon credits. These credits allow them to release a certain amount of CO2, carbon dioxide. If they manage to emit less, they can sell the extra credits to other companies. It creates a financial incentive to reduce the emissions. Now, CBAM will apply this idea to the imports. So the companies outside the EU, like those in India, will need to buy certificates to cover the emissions produced when making goods they sell to the Europe. For a big exporter like India, this is a big deal. Take example, for example, the Tata Steel. If an Indian company like JSW Steel export steel to the Europe, so now it is simple that they need to buy the CBAM certificates to cover the carbon emitted during the production. Since India doesn't have a carbon pricing system like the EU, European Union, this tax will have the effect which is it will make the exporting steel to Europe more expensive, making Indian goods less competitive. To give some perspective, in 2022, 27% of India's steel, that is iron and aluminum exports worth $8.2 billion were sent to Europe. Once CBAM is fully in place, these exports could face higher cost, and Indian companies might struggle to hold onto their share of the EU market. Indian steel makers like the JSW Steel, Tata Steel are already trying to prepare. JSW is investing in a green steel unit, and Tata Steel is working on cutting emission through its power division, Tata Power. But much of India's steel industry still relies on the coal, which is very carbon heavy. This means many Indian companies will have a tough time under the new EU rules. India's government has strongly objected to CPM. Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal has called the EU's rules irrational and said CBAM is an unfair barrier that targets developing countries like India. India's economic survey also says that policy goes against the Paris Agreement's principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. This idea is that developing countries like India shouldn't be held to the same standards as richer, industrialized nations because they are at different stages of development. When we are at the developing stage, the other countries are in the developed stage. So they should not be treated equally. Now, this brings up a bigger issue. While Europe is leading on climate action, developing countries like India, they still rely on heavily on fossil fuels. Moving to greener technologies is complicated and also costly. India needs an estimated $28 billion per year to meet its net zero target by 2070. But international funding has been limited, forcing the country to rely on its own resources. This adds even more financial pressure on industries already facing the rising cost. the steel industry will likely be hit hardest by the CBAM, as it's one of the most carbon intensive sectors. Indian steel production mostly uses the coal-based technologies like blast furnaces, which release a lot of carbon dioxide. With CBAM, Indian steel will be taxed based on these emissions, making it more expensive in the Europe, thereby reducing the competitiveness of the India. Experts predict this could cause a 10.5% drop in the exports, with aluminium and cement industries also likely to be affected. Switching to greener production methods, like using hydrogen based steel production, is one solution, but it requires the huge investment, and also it will take some time to have the investment and come up with the newer inventions. Many Indian companies may find it hard to make this shift quickly, putting them at a disadvantage compared to the European companies. But it's not just about trade. There are also bigger political and economic factors at play. While the EU argues that CBAM is necessary for global climate goals, many developing countries sees it as a protectionism meant to protect the European industries from competition under the cover of environmental rules. There's a concern that CBAM could create a climate club where wealthy nations can afford to trade in eco-friendly goods, while developing countries like India, they still be dependent on carbon-heavy industries are left out. For India, this is a serious issue. CBAM adds another layer of difficulty to its already tough challenge of balancing economic growth with cutting emissions. Higher production cost combined with the need to invest in cleaner technologies could put Indian industries in a difficult spot, stuck between the EU's regulation and their own financial limits. India has been vocal about the need for more help from richer countries, both in terms of money and technology, to make this transition smoother. But with the international climate finance falling short, India has mostly had to rely on its own efforts to fight the climate change. As CBAM's full implementation gets closer, the financial burden on Indian industries will only increase, making it harder for them to compete globally while also meeting the country's climate goals. In summary, CBAM is set to change the global trade, but for India, it's both an economic and political change. While Europe sees it as a key step to cut the emissions, India views it as another roadblock on its path to the development. Without enough financial and technological support, India's journey to a greener future and its ability to compete in the global market could be at the serious risk. Because, as we have seen, that there is a climate club which is being created, where the wealthy nations would be able to afford the trade in eco-friendly goods, while the developing countries they need to still be dependent on the carbon-heavy industries, and also they are left out. So now we need to see that how the JSW Steel and Tata Steel, which are already trying to prepare for this move, how they would be competing against the European industries, because there will be the heavy CBAM implemented on them, and this tax could reduce their competitiveness in the foreign market. So this was the topic where we have seen that how Europe's carbon tax could hurt the Indian exports, largely the exports of the steel which our country makes. And also this exports helps us to generate the huge amount of foreign exchange from the foreign countries. But as soon as this will be impacted, this will impact the export from the India. For more such informative content, do like our video, share our video with your friends, and also subscribe to our channel. Thank you, listeners.